before I get on to the recipe, I wanted to mention that before I touched anything or began anything, I washed my hands, and I also wiped down the surface that I prepared my food on. I wanted to make sure that I had a clean and sanitary workspace before I went any further with the recipe. Now on to the recipe. I'm going to be making scones today. Now I've already preheated the oven to 400 degrees and I've already greased the baking sheet. Now let's get into the ingredients. The first ingredient the recipe calls for is 3 cups of all-purpose flour. And we use all-purpose flour because it has a medium gluten content, which makes it a good middle-of-the-spectrum flour, making our scones not too cakey and not too stiff. So I've already added 2 cups, and then this is the last cup of flour. Next, we're going to be adding a 1/2 cup of white sugar. And we use sugar to first impart some sweetness, but also when mixed with butter, which we will do later in the recipe, it creates pockets that trap air and expand during baking, yielding a fluffier final product. And it also attracts and holds moisture in the scone, which will cause the scone to stay fresher longer. And sugar also inhibits the development of gluten, allowing the scone to have a tender, less chewy outcome. Next, we're going to add 5 tablespoons of our leavening agent, which is baking powder. And baking powder is made up of baking soda, cream of tartar, and a drying agent, which is also known as cornstarch. And it is used because there is no real acidic agent in the recipe. And so it calls for 5, and I've already added 4, and so that was the 5th one. Next, we're going to add 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And salt is used because not only does it add flavor, but it also adds structure to the dough by strengthening the gluten. We're next going to cut in our butter into our dry ingredients, and the recipe calls for 3/4 cup of butter, so I'm going to just add that. Now that we have all of our dry ingredients mixed together, we're going to move on and combine all of our wet liquid ingredients in a separate bowl. Now, butter is our lipid, and it is used because it prevents disulfide bonding, and this could also be referred to as shortening. And this method will give our scone a fluffy, biscuit, muffin-like texture. The next ingredient the recipe calls for is an egg, and the egg needs to be beaten. And eggs will help set the structure of the scone, and they can also act as a leavening agent. And the egg whites trap the air bubbles in the batter, and when whisked, they hold that air in and help the scone attain a light, puffy rise. As well, the egg also adds a richness to the overall flavor of the scone, and they also act as a binder, which helps hold all of the ingredients together. The last ingredient our recipe calls for is 1 cup of milk. And milk enhances the development of gluten of starch in the flour and therefore serves as a toughener. And milk also contains proteins which act as a structural enhancer, and it's also going to be used for flavoring and to aid in fermentation. Now I'm just going to add this cup of milk to the already beaten egg. Now I'm going to mix the dry ingredients, the flour, baking powder, all of that stuff, and the butter with the milk and the egg that I just mixed in this separate bowl. So I'm just going to pour that right in there. And the recipe calls for it to be mixed until it is moist, so that's what I'm going to do. Okay, now this is the dough that we are left with after I combined all the ingredients and mixed, and it now is formed into this dough. So now I'm going to knead the dough so then we can form our scones. And I set out a little of flour here so the dough doesn't stick to the table. I'm going to knead the dough. The recipe said not to knead too much, so I'm just going to do this for probably about 30 seconds. Now typically we would use the window pane test, which we use to tell if the dough has been kneaded enough, but since the recipe said that you really shouldn't be kneading much at all, I decided not to use the window pane test. I'm going to roll out our dough so we can cut the dough into wedges and then put on our baking sheet. Now that we have rolled out our dough, I'm going to use a pizza cutter to slice into the dough and form them into little triangles. So There is my triangle, and now I'm just going to start laying these on the baking sheet. Okay, now I've cut the dough into these wedges and I've placed them on the baking sheet, and now I'm going to place them in the oven. Now they will cook for 15 minutes. Now that they baked for 15 minutes and they've got to a nice golden brown, I'm going to take them out. Here's our end product. You can see it has a nice golden brown color. It's risen really nicely, and I cut one open and you can see just how thick it is inside.